Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webinar on grazing cover crops. My name is Katie Traje. I'm the ruminant livestock specialist with Perennia Food and Agriculture here in Nova Scotia. I've been with Perennia for just over a year now. Prior to joining Perennia, I did my master's degree at the University of Guelph in Ontario, where I studied market name nutrition, and I belong to the Beef Nutrition Lab. So for today's webinar, I'm going to be going over an intro and some benefits to cover crops in general, along with the benefits of grazing cover crops. And I'm going to be speaking about a cover crop grazing demonstration that Perennia hosted in December of 2021. So I'm going to start off the webinar going over benefits of cover crops in general. So I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with cover crops, but I'm going to start at the beginning. So what is a cover crop? So cover crops, they're usually planted to improve and protect the condition of the soil. So they're done with that soil in mind. So it's an agronomic focus. So as the name implies, a cover crop physically covers that soil and it will hold on to it. Cover crops, they're often planted after a summer harvested crop such as wheat or rye comes off the field. August and September are a really reliable time of year to get cover crops into the ground. The growing season is still quite good and it gives us enough time to get that crop established before the cooler weather sets in. However, annuals can be grown anytime during the growing season that there is a need to fill a niche and that there is bare soil that is exposed. So there's many benefits to implementing cover crops. So one of the major ones is to help prevent soil erosion and increase water absorption. So as the cover crop physically covers that soil, it's going to act as a barrier and it's going to help to decrease the velocity of precipitation. So as that rainfall is about to hit that soil, it's going to hit the crop first, which is going to not only slow down the velocity of it, but it's going to break those droplets into smaller droplets so that they're more likely to be absorbed into the soil, and it's less likely that that rainfall is going to carry that soil sediment off in the form of erosion. Another way that it helps to prevent soil erosion and increase water absorption, so the root networks of the cover crops, they're going to help to increase the porosity of the soil so that it acts more like a sponge, so it is able to absorb that water. Another way that this helps is that as that water would be moving across the surface, it's going to encounter all these little plants that are going to help to slow down the speed of that water moving across the surface so that sheet erosion is much less likely to happen, and it's much more likely that that water is going to be absorbed. And then as a result of this, they're going to help to keep soil out of our water courses and improve water quality. So there's going to be less nutrients and less pesticides, hopefully, that are entering our waterways. So another benefit that cover crops offer is that they're really useful when we're trying to manage our soil nutrients. So certain cover crop species such as radishes and rye, they're really good at uptaking excess nutrients from the previous crop and holding on to them. There's also been some reports that 84% of nitrogen loss in Nova Scotia cropland occurs during the non-growing season. So if we can have something that's covering our soil during the season and it's able to hold on to our nutrients, we're going to see a lot less nitrogen losses. And this is really important both from an agronomic standpoint, but also an environmental standpoint. Cover crops, they also give us the opportunity to fix nitrogen into the soil. So legumes, they are able to pull atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through their root system. So another benefit that cover crops offer, they can help to increase the carbon sequestration in our soils. So the scientific mechanism for this, it's not very well documented, but there is evidence that this does occur. So there was a recent study from the University of Guelph in Ontario that demonstrated that soil organic carbon content in soils with cover crops was between 11 and 22% greater than the control treatment that did not use cover crops. So if we are able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store it into our soils, this is going to be really beneficial from an environmental standpoint. And also it's going to be very useful for building up our topsoil. So another benefit that cover crops offer is that they're really useful for improving the condition of our soils. So in a system that implements cover crops year after year, we can start to rebuild our topsoil in our soil organic matter. So of course, this is going to depend very heavily on our management practices, things like whether we're implementing no-till or not. Also, cover crops are going to help to improve the porosity and the ability of our soils to uptake water and nutrients as well. Cover crops, they will need to be terminated at some point when it's time to get our next crop going in the rotation. So this can be done a couple of ways. They can be sprayed to burn them down. They can be tilled under. In the case of winter kill, you can simply wait for them to decompose. But another way that you can terminate this crop is to graze it down and convert it into manure, which is the focus of the webinar, which is grazing cover crops. So if we shift our focus a little bit and we think about the benefits that grazing cover crops offers from a livestock point of view, a main benefit is that it's going to extend the grazing season. So grazing pasture, this is always going to be the cheapest way to feed our grazing livestock species. And it's going to be much easier to feed a high quality annual during the time of year, such as in December, than it would be to try to make do with a low quality perennial at that time of year. So another benefit that we're going to be getting from grazing those cover crops down, we're going to be further increasing the returns from that same piece of land. So we're going to be getting the returns from that original crop. We're going to be getting some indirect returns from the benefits from those cover crops, so improving our soil health and our soil structure. We're going to be getting the feed value from that cover crop, plus the benefits of extended grazing. So we're going to be saving money in the form of yardage costs. So we're going to be spending less money on harvesting extra feed, hauling that extra feed, storing that manure, and then having to spread that manure. So as that manure is deposited directly on that field, it's going to be really readily available for that next crop in the rotation. And also less nitrogen is going to be lost this way compared to the alternative, which would be feeding those animals in confinement and then having to store that manure and then haul it and spread it. So a lot of nitrogen is lost during this process through volatilization, so that nitrogen is going to enter into the atmosphere rather than become available for our crops. So if that manure is being deposited directly onto that soil, there's a much less likely chance that nitrogen is going to be lost. Another benefit of having animals out on pasture, so they're going to be trampling that plant material. That's going to create a better plant to soil contact, and it's going to help to break that cover crop down sooner and build that organic matter sooner. Grazing cover crops are also useful to help to rest our existing pastures. So this can help to improve our stand health and improve productivity of that piece of land moving forward. So this is really useful at times of year when those pasture systems are a bit more vulnerable. So during the earlier in the season or later in the year. By grazing cover crops early in the year, if we have something such as winter wheat or rye that's been overwintered, we can extend our grazing season and get our animals out on pasture or get them out grazing earlier in the year while letting our existing pastures get a good head start. And then throughout the year, if we have a time when our pastures, they might be under some stress, maybe some drought, if we've got an annual that's available that we can get our animals off of our pastures and give them a bit of a rest so that we can improve their health. So another benefit that cover crops offer is that they present us with an opportunity to integrate livestock onto farms that wouldn't traditionally have livestock, so small grain or vegetable operations being one example. So there is a lot of opportunities for partnerships between neighboring farms. So for example, if one farm has cattle and the neighboring farm is a small grains operation, if that small grain operation plants a cover crop and an agreement is worked out to graze his neighbor's cattle on his cover crop, each of those producers are going to be receiving a benefit. So the grain producer, he's going to get the benefit of having that manure and those nutrients that are being applied onto his land, and he's also going to have that trampling occur. And then the cattle producer is going to get the benefit of hopefully getting a really good quality feed, maybe at a time of year when he may not have that good quality feed out on his pasture. So there are some potential challenges for situations like this. Details are going to have to be worked out. Typically in the situation, the livestock producer would pay the crop producer for the value of that feed. Some other challenges that do have some solutions are things such as fencing and water. So fencing, most grain producers are going to have no need for fencing, but portable electric fencing, it works really well for cattle who are trained to respect it. So it is mostly a psychological barrier, so it is really important that those cattle are already going to be trained prior to being moved onto another piece of land. Electric netting, it works really well for sheep, both for keeping sheep and guardian animals in, and for keeping predators out. Water is also a potential problem that requires a solution. So for more remote areas that don't have an existing water source, hauling water on tanks on trailers, so this is one way to get around that. For areas that might not be so remote and there might be a water source, above ground pipe can work really well, or solar watering systems using a pump and a solar panel. So this can move water into tanks as well. So now I'm just going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what it can look like on farm. So Perennia hosted a demonstration looking at grazing cattle on a cover crop cocktail mix this past December in Falmouth, Nova Scotia. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Manning family farm, it is run by Dean and Catherine Manning and their family. It's located in Falmouth, and they grow vegetables, they've got some greenhouses, they grow some small grains, and they have a herd of beef cattle. And then something I want to highlight, they were the recipients of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association Environmental Stewardship Award in 2021, which is a national recognition, which is really wonderful. So the cover crop grazing demonstration was hosted on December 4th on farm. Cattle began grazing on December 2nd, so just 2 days prior to the demo. And it was a cover crop cocktail mix that was planted in late August after a winter rye crop had been harvested. And the group of animals that were grazing, it was a group of 48 bred heifers who weighed an average of 1,200 pounds. So this is a photo of that field in early July, which was harvested in August. So this is a better angle of that field here. So it's an 11-acre block. This photo was taken in mid-September, so that is the cover crop that's on it. It's been established for a couple weeks at this point. So it was broken up into 3 blocks when the cattle were on it. So the first block was approximately this area right here. So cattle had access to that for 1 week. And then they were moved on to the second block, which was centerpiece right here. And then after that, the second week, then the fence was removed so that cattle had access to the second piece and the third piece, and they could go back and forth. But the first piece here remained fenced off. I just went over this. And so just some info on inputs. So fertilizer was applied twice. The mix was planted at 3 different seeding densities using a conventional seeder. So we were interested in seeing whether there was any discernible differences in the seeding densities. And then seed cost for the project was $1,600, which included the shipping for 1,000 pounds of seed. So that's just a photo on the day of the demonstration. So it was a cover crop cocktail mix that was chosen. So a cocktail mix typically consists of 7 or more species that are chosen in order to maximize the diversity of that plant stand. So this was the mix that was chosen for this particular situation. So the mix was mostly composed of fall rye, winter peas, there was some hairy vetch, some different clover species, turnips, radishes, there was some forage kale, and then a couple others in smaller inclusion rates. So this is a photo of what came out of a 1 foot by 1 foot quadrat a week before the demonstration. So you can see that there is a mix of different species present. So Dean reported that it took approximately a week for the cows to learn how to eat the radishes and the turnips. So this is a photo of what that crop looked like the day of the demonstration. So there was a bit of frost kill at this point, so earlier in the season there would have been quite a bit more feed that was available. So that's just a function of the timing of deciding when to put the cattle out. So there was still quite a bit of feed, mostly attributed due to the roots, such as the turnips and the radishes. But there was some frost kill on some species, so the clovers were non-existent at this point, same with the sunflowers. So this is just a quick video snippet. And this is another little video snippet, so that's just what that first piece of land looked like. So we did do some feed testing prior to the cows going out. So about a week before they went out, we took some tests to send to the lab, and it revealed that the crude protein levels were about 15.5%, and the energy levels, so that's the TDN, the total digestible nutrients, was 71%. So just some context of how that relates to an animal's requirements. So a cow is going to require somewhere between 7 and 11% crude protein, and 55 and 65% energy, depending where she is during her gestation and lactation. And then smaller feeders, so they have a higher protein requirement as they're still growing up their frames. So they're going to require 14% crude protein. And then animals being fed to finish, they have a lower requirement for protein, so they only require 10%. So regardless of the group, we're going to be slightly exceeding their nutritional requirements. So if we had feeders out here based on the energy content of this feed, we would be able to estimate that they would gain an average of 2 pounds per day. So just one observation from Dean, he noticed that his cows, they seemed very full and content while they were grazing this mix. So he reported that they weren't trapping the fence and they weren't bawling, and he did supplement with some silage bales during that last week, but they didn't seem particularly interested in them. So this he mostly attributed to the turnips and the radishes. So this is a photo that Dean took in mid-December after we got a fairly decent snowfall. So you can see that there is snow on the faces of his cattle, and he said that they seem to be quite happy to dig through that snow to get at that feed. So Dean got 3 weeks worth of grazing off of this piece of land. He did supplement with 3 bales of silage during that last week. Also that first 3-acre block, it did still have roots such as the turnips and the radishes that they still could have been eaten, but the cows at the time that they were in that piece of land, they hadn't learned how to eat them. So there was technically more feed out there, and they could have been turned back into that piece of land, but Dean is interested in seeing whether there are soil differences in the spring. So as I mentioned, there was some frost kill on some species. So again, that's just a function of the timing of when those animals are going to be put onto that pasture. And then just when we're figuring out how much feed there is, so looking at the different seeding rates, so some samples were collected in September. So the seeding rate of 70 pounds per acre actually had the best yield for whatever reason. However, when you were actually out there walking the pasture, there was no discernible differences. Dean mentioned that he would like to try looking at some lower seeding rates, so comparing how 40 and 50 pounds per acre compares to the 60. We also took some samples at the end of November, and this yielded that there was an average of 4,500 pounds of dry matter per acre of the above ground biomass, so all that leafy material, and then an average of 2,800 pounds of dry matter per acre of roots such as turnips and the radishes. So combined, that yielded an average of 7,300 pounds of dry matter per acre. So then, when I'm taking this information to calculate grazing days per acre, I'm going to use the assumption that a cow is going to eat approximately 3% of her body weight in dry matter per day. So quick illustration, a cow who weighs 1,000 pounds, this means I'm going to expect her to eat 30 pounds of dry matter per day. And then I'm also going to assume that roughly 50% of the forage that is available is going to be grazed, and then 50% of it is going to be trampled, picked over, just generally wasted. So based on this table just illustrates how I would expect how many grazing days per acre per cow I would expect based on different body weights, and whether or not they are eating the above ground material or if they are also eating the roots as well. So Dean's cows weighed an average of 1,200 pounds and they were eating the root system, so this would mean that there's 102 grazing days per acre per cow. So this does seem like quite a large number to begin with, but then if you factor in that there's 48 head out there, it works out to just over 2 grazing days per acre. And they were roughly 3.5 acre blocks, so that works out to just over 7 days, which really is how long Dean did keep them out. So this assumption does check out. So just some things to consider if you are considering planting a cover crop that you may also wish to graze. You'll want to think about things such as biomass production, so you'll want to plant something that actually is able to grow quite a lot of feed. You'll want to think about the stage of production and the nutrition requirements of who it actually is who is going to be grazing, and try to match up plant species that can meet their nutritional requirements. You'll also want to think about the anticipated weather conditions when you want to graze it, and then the ability of species to regrow. So in terms of plants that are able to produce a large amount of biomass, brassicas are particularly good for producing large amounts of feed. So their strength is providing producers with a high-yielding, good quality forage option at a time of year when most cool season grasses would not be available. So some things to consider would be forage rape and forage kale. I just want to caution that brassica crops, they can cause some health disorders in grazing animals if they're not managed properly. So just something to keep in mind. So another option for something that produces a large amount of biomass would be something such as sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass. It is really good at producing large amounts of feed. So this would be targeting a different time of year. So they are a warm season grass. So this is an annual crop that you would be grazing more in the summer months rather than December. You would have to be quite careful with sorghum Sudan grass. There are some concerns with prussic acid developing when those plants are stressed. So after a drought event or after a frost, those plants will produce prussic acid, which can be toxic to livestock. So there are some producers in Ontario who are successfully grazing lands on sorghum Sudan grass, and they're not running into those prussic acid concerns. So it's just a matter of careful management and being mindful of those prussic acid concerns. And then regarding stages of production of animals, this is keeping in mind that dry animals are going to have much lower requirements than animals who are growing or gestating. So they're going to have lower requirements for both protein and energy. If we do need to increase the protein requirements of that cover crop, legumes are really good at increasing protein. Again, though, you do have to be careful with grazing legumes. Bloat is one concern, but that's mostly a function of good management. And then the time of year is something you'll want to consider as well. So one way that you can extend that grazing season, you can get your animals out on pasture earlier in the year if you're grazing something such as winter rye or winter wheat that's been planted the fall before. And then you'll have to consider the regrowth ability of those species if you're interested in grazing them more than once. So some species are not going to be very tolerant and they're not going to be able to bounce back from being grazed. Others will. So things such as rye and vetch are more tolerant of being grazed. And then oats are better than barley or wheat. So that's really what I've got for you today. So just some take-home points. So there really exists a huge opportunity for the integration of crop and livestock operations. So the key to making this successful is to try to keep things as flexible as possible. I would recommend considering cocktail mixes for diversity in order to help to mitigate some of those health concerns if you were grazing a pure stand. And then try to choose some plant species based on the grazing requirements of your livestock. Thank you.